everyone, Ripley Sellers with Bob's Watches. I'm here in the studio with Justin for another episode of Vintage of the Week, where we pull aside one remarkable vintage timepiece and share with you just why we love it. So, Justin, got a cool one here, and not a Rolex, not a vintage Rolex.
Yes.
But before you get into it, what do you have on your wrist? Quick wrist check.
Wrist check. This is one of my favorites. I've worn it before. I'm sure I will wear it again. We're talking about the Oyster Perpetual. That slate blue dial with the blue markers, I just think is really classy, really clean. It's a great watch.
Great watch, and I love how it kind of echoes the color scheme of the current Rolex Yachtmaster.
Yes.
Kind of like ice blue and
yes.
Oh, yeah,
which is my favorite Yachtmaster. Because of the color scheme, but anyway, fantastic. What are you wearing today?
Well, we're talking about a vintage Omega Speedmaster, so I'm wearing my Omega Speedmaster. Not really a vintage one, from about 2000, so it's, you know, but I mean, as we're about to get into, yeah. So I think in terms of vintage Speedmasters, probably the most important one to mention is the 321, which is the movement that was used in the very first one from 1957, and was the one that was tested by NASA and the one first worn on the moon. But in 1968, Omega came out with a new generation of the Speedmaster that looked almost identical to its predecessor, but it used a different movement, the caliber 861. So that's what we have here today, the reference 145.022. Again, this replaced the 145.012, which at a glance looks the exact same, except it has the 321 movement rather than the 861. Biggest difference there, column wheel controlled chronograph in the 321, and it's a cam lever operated one in this one. So, I mean,
all internals, I mean, visually they're very
visually,
similar,
yeah. But where I think this is important is the difference in price.
Yes.
So all 321 Speedmasters, that's the cream of the crop. The older you get, generally the more expensive they get. But for someone who just wants a vintage Speedmaster and doesn't want to pay like top of the line vintage Omega prices, this is the #1 reference I recommend.
It's a great entry point into the vintage Speedmasters. Like you said,
great entry point into vintage watches.
Yes, absolutely. Outside of this, this model, there's a big jump in price that goes up from, if you're looking for a Speedmaster, there's, this is kind of like if you're looking for something to get into without breaking the bank, there's not a lot of choices, and this is absolutely the best one. I love the way it looks. Like we talked about, visually they don't change a whole lot.
Well, I mean, look at mine.
It has the classic, that Moonwatch look, that dial that you expect. That is, it's synonymous with Speedmasters. That's when you picture Speedmaster, this is what you picture.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people go for the modern one because they want a vintage watch, and people like the modern Speedmaster because it's about as close to a vintage watch as you can get without actually getting a vintage watch.
Right.
But in this instance, with the 145.022, you can actually get a vintage watch for negligibly more than a modern watch that kind of, stays true to its vintage aesthetic. And again, the current Moonwatch isn't a reissue or anything. They've basically been producing the same watch this whole time. But I mean, for someone who actually wants a vintage piece, this is the obvious choice, and it's also kind of an important Speedmaster relative to Omega's history. So obviously the 321s are the collector favorites because they're the ones that first made it to the moon. But the 861 with a cam actuated chronograph has served as the foundation for the Moonwatch movement from this point in the late 60s all the way through the current production models. The current 3861 movement, coaxial, master chronometer, hacking seconds, is very, very different, but it still uses a cam lever rather than a column wheel.
Right.
So, it basically set off what has been the longest running generation of the Speedmaster. So it's got that, vintage box to check. You get tritium lume. And I mean, this particular example is in really honest shape.
It is. This is, it's a good way to describe it. It's a very honest watch, right? It's not a safe queen. You can tell it's been worn. It hasn't been abused or destroyed. It just has that, I like to call it character that you want in your vintage watch. It's been around for some years, and it's lived a life, and it's seen some things, and you can tell. And I really like that about the vintage watch. There's quite a few things I like about this one. To start off with, I'm going to say the bracelet. Speedmaster bracelets are not something that has ranked high on my list of
except the current gen, which is nice, but again, that's again,
you're right.
Very
the current
watch.
Gen is nice, and I think it's a vast improvement over the previous. But throughout time, I think there's been some more misses than hits. Well, this is a great one. I love this bracelet.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite Speedmaster bracelets.
Yes.
I like the older ones. Love the older flat links still. But like
Yes.
as you were saying, the previous generation of bracelets really wasn't much to write home about. So much so that I actually swapped it out for this Forstner Comfit because there's no taper. It's a big chunky bracelet.
Yeah.
It's lightweight and it kind of really matches the aesthetic of the watch, where you've got hollow center links and
Right.
you got a plexi crystal. It just plays into the vintage vibe better than this big solid link thing like you'll find on the standard production
Exactly,
models.
and it's there. And for me, it's always if I want a Speedmaster, I want the bracelet so that I can take it off and put it on a leather strap and just have the bracelet because I like having these things, resale value or whatever. But I don't really plan on wearing it on the bracelet so much. This one, I can really see wearing this on the bracelet. Yeah, I will be putting it on leather because Speedmaster and leather is, that's a match made in heaven. But
Speedmaster on anything is match made in heaven.
absolutely. I mean, there's probably nothing more versatile on straps, but the bracelet on this, I could totally wear this on this bracelet and love it. I love the feel of it. I love that it's appropriate. It has that vintage, it's a vintage bracelet, so it does have that vintage styling and feel. And I love it. That's one of my favorite things about this watch.
It matches the watch. So for me, if you have a modern Rolex ceramic sports watch, you want a solid, beefy bracelet on it because it just goes with the aesthetic. This is, it's a chronograph with an acrylic crystal that has its origins in the 1950s, or this model, the 1960s. It's kind of okay to have a lighter weight bracelet. It just sort of fits with the vibe of it. And this isn't this heavy, over-engineered thing. It's this remarkably engineered, well, it's capable of going to space and all that. Yeah. But it just fits, in my opinion, having a light bracelet. I mean, having a light bracelet on it.
I agree, 100%. I also really like the bezel and the condition. I mean, it more so in these conversations than others. We're talking about this specific watch, right? Because this watch is for sale. This watch is going on the site. Someone can purchase this exact one. And this bezel is in great shape. So many times I see these bezels are just destroyed or, just lost. I mean, they're aluminum, so, they get scratches, and being a tool watch and, having those years on them, a lot of times they don't weather that well. And this one is in really clean shape.
It's in really clean shape, but doesn't look brand new, and that's kind of perfect. That's kind of what I'd say about all of aspects of the watch. It's not like a dead stock example that's come out of the late 70s and is now here today. It shows its life. It looks like a vintage Speedmaster, and if the reason you're buying a vintage Speedmaster over one of the modern ones, which is 95% the same from a visual glance, is to have that kind of heritage and have it not look like a brand new watch, this kind of checks those boxes. Having a dead stock 145022 is awesome, but at the same time, at a quick glance, it's going to look near identical to a more modern version.
Yeah.
So you kind of want that patina, you want that wear, you want a little bit of fading on the bezel, because that's really what makes it a vintage piece.
Yeah, that's what separates it, right? I mean, like we talked about things like the bracelet, and those are the details. I mean, being so similar that, like you said, this watch has been around for so long and really hasn't changed much. It's not like, they reissued a copy. This watch is fantastic, and they haven't needed to change a whole lot through all this time. So those little differences in things like, that little bit of vintage character in the patina, or the style of bracelet they use then and they don't use now, those are kind of all, the little ticks that kind of, bring you that vintage feel and that greatness about the vintage piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Speedmaster is kind of an undisputed icon in the world of horology. I mean, the fact that Omega's changed it so little over the years is proof that how well the design works. I own a Moonwatch. It makes perfect sense why someone wants to own a Moonwatch, but within that canon of just the greater classic steel Moonwatch, you can go a lot of different ways, and I think for someone who wants vintage, but is priced out of the original 321 movement ones, this is the de facto choice. It makes the most sense. It's negligibly more expensive than a modern one if you wanted to just buy it on the open market, and I think the fact that that exists is so special. You look at other iconic sports watches, and the vintage examples are exponentially more than the retail price of the current one. I mean, if you want a vintage Rolex Daytona, another iconic sports chronograph, starting prices for a hand-wind first-generation one, we're talking, tens of thousands of dollars as a point of entry, compared to the 15 ballpark retail price of one. Granted, you can't get one for that.
Right.
But the fact that you can actually pick up a genuine vintage Speedmaster from the late 70s for only a little bit more than the current one, I mean, kind of seems like a no-brainer if you want a vintage watch.
Yeah, and to add that Speedmaster to your collection, or honestly, I think this is a great start to your collection. I mean, we talk about that even in modern. If you're just getting into watches or just getting into luxury watches, if you asked a bunch of people what their recommendation was, Speedmaster would come up on that list more than a couple times. And I think it's true for vintage as well. I mean, there's, you could spend an almost unlimited amount of money, but you can start with something like this watch and never have to sell it and never feel like it's really being, overshadowed by one of the, the more collectible, more expensive pieces. Like, I would be very happy wearing this, even if you have, vintage Daytonas and these other, exponentially more expensive watches. I would still love to give this the wrist time and, wear it every day.
Oh, and I think that's kind of the magic of the Speedmaster. For not relative to the price of luxury watches from, blue chip marquees in the industry, the Speedmaster is very affordable, all things considered. And for someone who wants to get that bit of horology and they want a vintage example, looking at Rolex sports watches, you're priced out of it. This makes so much sense. It's easy to get service because they made this 861 and then the 1861, which is basically the same movement, for such a long time. You're not going to have these headaches of other vintage watches where you're looking for something that's been discontinued for 60 years. It's an easy watch you can wear every day. People do. And if your collection grows from here and you end up owning 50 Speedmasters, this one exists right in line with it. And if your collection grows to have six-figure pieces, the Speedmaster is kind of a remarkable watch that can comfortably exist in any collection, whether it's the flagship piece or the most affordable in it.
Right.
And a vintage Speedmaster, it can exist right there alongside solid gold vintage Daytonas and Richard Milles and all of that stuff, because it is just an icon of horology. I mean,
it always will be. It's about as classic as you can get. Yeah, it's great. I mean, fantastic. Someone's going to pick this one up and be extremely happy with it, and it will be a great addition to someone's collection.
Yeah, I always kind of wish this one came up for me at the right price. I always like the 357 too, because you got acrylic in the front and sapphire in the back, which is always lovely. But I sometimes wish I had picked up a classic Moonwatch, and if I would got one, it would be a vintage one, and it would be a 145022 because I can't afford a 321.
That's a great choice.
Well, I think that about wraps it up. Great watch, great foray into vintage world. Also cool to talk about Omega for a change.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's nice to see something that's not Rolex. I mean, just in the vintage world, there's so many things. Rolex, as is the case so often, even with modern, kind of steals a lot of the light. They get a lot of the attention. So I love seeing a non-Rolex in here, and I like Omega as a brand, and the Moonwatch as well. So yeah, very refreshing and a very nice addition.
Yeah, and at the price point too. Sometimes it's an awesome vintage sports chronograph. Price is $50,000 to $150,000. This, like I keep saying, it costs negligibly more than a standard Moonwatch all day long.
Very attainable.
And you can find a bunch of them. Personally, I love the patina on this one, so if this would be a strong contender if I was looking, but I think that's kind of the beauty of it, no two are alike. And if you like this one, head on over to the site and pick it up, because once it sells, it's gone, and you'll be looking for another.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's our episode of Vintage of the Week. This is the Omega Speedmaster, reference 145022. Feel free to drop us a comment, let us know what you think of this affordable vintage Omega, and don't forget to join us next week to see what watch we have in store for you.